Good afternoon and welcome to EUROMED Migration Talks. I'm your host, Marco Ricorda from the International Center for Migration Policy Development. And today, I have the pleasure to be accompanied by Aline, Sara, co-founder and CEO of NaTakallam, a social enterprise that pairs Arabic-speaking displaced persons with learners all around the world. Aline, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Aline, you have a special relationship with language. Thanks to your enterprise, people are learning Arabic via the help of displaced people in a way that, it creates a great win-win situation for both migrants and hosting communities. In particular, what we'd like to hear your opinion about is over the past few years, we see how the migration narrative, especially in the Mediterranean, has been strongly polarized in a sort of dichotomy that puts on one side emotional reporting face to face with security and integration concerns, lately even health concerns. Now, in your experience, or even within the people you talked to thanks to NaTakallam, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced or exacerbated this polarization?
Well, sadly, I think that COVID-19 has already triggered and will be triggering such dire economic repercussions around the world that will obviously affect local populations, that all of the already existing fears of migrants coming in, taking jobs, etc., will only be reinforced. So sadly, I do think that COVID-19 is not helping the situation for migration.
And what about the narrative? What about the way migration is perceived, discussed both among the main public and within the media? Do you think that this is going to be even more polarized, or there are hopes, for instance, like the example that NaTakallam brings, to actually bring the debate back to the middle? How do you see this changing?
I think the biggest challenge we face when it comes to narrative issues around refugees and migrants is preaching the choir. I think that NaTakallam is a very interesting example. Just to reiterate what NaTakallam is, the NaTakallam is a social enterprise, and our goal is to provide an income to refugees and displaced people, regardless of their location and status, by hiring them through the freelance gig digital economy as online tutors, teachers, and translators. And we provide three main services. The first one, which was what NaTakallam was born with out of Lebanon, which is my country of origin, which is hiring Syrians who were teaching Arabic via Skype. But today, NaTakallam offers language classes in Arabic, Persian, French, and Spanish. So with refugees across the world from those, the countries that speak that language. We also provide curated virtual exchange and academic programs in schools across the world. A lot of this is actually in the US. And then we also provide translation services. So in aggregate, everything relates to the digital economy and language. So what's interesting is a person who will sign up to NaTakallam will likely already be sensitive to the refugee issue and will be open to supporting refugees, which brings a bit of a tricky situation if our goal is to also build bridges and create understanding. That being said, we also have programs in schools and universities. We're trying to bring these into corporations. And there is where we are seeing very powerful impact from a conflict resolution and cultural exchange perspective, because we'll be seeing young British learners at a school in London, or American learners at a school in Kentucky. And they are, for the first time, actually speaking to refugees rather than hearing about refugees through their politicians. And we all know that we're living in really difficult times from a political perspective with regards to the refugee issue. Politicians are using the refugee and migrant cause as a scapegoat for political means, and there is a rise of populism. So I think that I would say that from NaTakallam's perspective, where we're seeing the strongest impact is in these types of programs. Now, zooming back to COVID, yes, I think we've seen people talk about how migrants are on the forefront of the COVID battle, with lots of doctors and nurses. and, immigrants and migrants who have this background and are on the grounds. But I unfortunately, I wish I could be very optimistic, but I think that while this is a momentary topic and that we're seeing this, I do think that those who are sensitive to this are the ones who already are slightly more favorable to the topic of migrants. And so I think that all of us change makers really have to think deeper about how we can not only keep building these conversations, but try to get to those who aren't the choir. We don't want to just preach the choir. We want to go beyond. We want to change mindsets from a very deep perspective.
Now, in relation to your social enterprise, if I look at some data, I see that since the founding of your of NaTakallam, we have had almost 200 people that have generated over $800,000, performed over 30,000 hours of conversation sessions with 8,000 euros in 90 countries. I mean, apart from this fantastic success that inevitably also raises awareness about the impact of refugees and the migrant communities in the host communities, could you tell us more about how you came up with this idea? I mean, how did that happen?
Sure. So as I quickly mentioned earlier, my family is Lebanese. I'm originally from Lebanon. I was born in New York, however, and I grew up in New York, and there was a civil war in Lebanon at the time, and that's why I grew up in the US and not in Beirut. And what's interesting is lots of Lebanese who left Lebanon during that time actually were able to immigrate to the countries that they came to. There's lots of Lebanese in France, lots of Lebanese around the world. So I grew up shuttling back and forth between New York and Beirut. So even during the conflict, my family would take us back. So I've been exposed to what it is to be from a country that's enduring conflict. And I grew up really just also conscious of how lucky I was to grow up in New York in a normal, safe environment. From a language perspective, Lebanese tend to be bilingual and trilingual. So I grew up speaking at home mostly French with a mix of spoken Lebanese dialect. And I went to the French lycée in New York, and I, of course, learned English as an American being in the US. So I've constantly been around multiculturalism and multilingualism. And unfortunately, as is the case for many of the Lebanese diaspora members, our Arabic tends to be very weak. We are not very good with formal Arabic. We speak a bit of what we call kitchen Arabic. And my career has mostly been in human rights, humanitarian work, and journalism. So speaking Arabic was very important to me. And so I lived in Lebanon for a couple of years, and I worked as a journalist during the Arab uprisings. And when I was back in New York, where I did my master's, that was 2014. We were at the height of the Syrian conflict. And I was watching Lebanon, which now is crumbling again. But at the time, Lebanon was trying to recover still. We've been trying to recover from the civil war for 15 plus years. And then Syria was happening, and we had about a million and a half Syrians come into Lebanon. And Syrians are not given a right to work there. So I was in New York. I was watching the situation, this catastrophic situation. I had done a lot of reports on Syrian refugees, on human rights issues. And, it's just, Europe is talking about a refugee crisis, but the truth is the refugee crises are typically in the developing countries that are neighboring conflict zones. So for me, I was just thinking of what this represents from a regional perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, given how volatile the situation is politically in the Middle East. And I was just trying to tell myself, what can we do? Because Lebanese are concerned about losing their jobs, and Syrians also cannot survive if they don't have access to an income. So I was looking at the situation, and I was also looking for ways to work on my Arabic, because I was in New York and I wanted to speak with native speakers. And I have had a long history with Skype and Lebanon. I would always Skype with my grandmother. I've also myself been a tutor. I've taught both French and English. And I had an Arabic tutor when I was in Lebanon. And I believe that there's a very powerful dynamic in one-on-one tutoring, where beyond the very deep language training you also get to know your tutor, because you will tend to be more personal and talk about more personal things. which I think is the crux of what we need today to understand what it is to be a refugee. So I kind of coupled these things together and I thought, you know what, Syrians are in Lebanon and they speak excellent Arabic and they need access to an income, but they can't work as employees in Lebanon. And yet we have this new realm called the digital economy, the freelance economy. So actually, what if we could create a program where anyone around the world who wants to learn a language can do it online and their tutor would be a refugee. And in this case, it was a Syrian refugee in Lebanon who would then get an income, who would also get a restored sense of dignity and purpose because while money is an issue, there's so many other layers and challenges faced also from a psychosocial perspective when you're displaced. And at the same time, learners get affordable, flexible language practice with native speakers that has a very strong social impact. So that is the idea. That's when the seed was planted.
On this very point, NaTakallam leverages the global gig economy and accessible technology to transcend borders and create income opportunities for displaced people. Do you think that technology can play a key role in accelerating inclusion of vulnerable groups?
Yes, I mean, technology is a tool and every tool can be used for good or for bad. I think that in NaTakallam's case, we found a really simple and very powerful way to leverage technology to provide economic inclusion for refugees, but also very community and human inclusion. Actually, when we ask the tutors on our platform what is the most powerful impact NaTakallam has on their lives, they actually say the exposure to students around the world. That, you know, we have students from really, you know, dozens of countries. We have some tutors who are teaching Chinese, Japanese students, American students, Australian students, Italian students. So they find that so enriching because they are refugees who are, yes, they're forced to be displaced, but typically refugees can't move because they're stuck as a refugee, and yet they are traveling the world and making friendship worldwide through their screen. So this is an example of economic integration, but also social integration, rekindling refugees' lost social capital. I would warn, however, against glorifying technology and considering technology a fast and quick solution. Technology is an enabler, and our work is very human-centered. And also, technology is also one of the reasons why we're seeing such polarization through misinformation and through social media networks that can also propagate negative messages.
What could be the added value of social entrepreneurship in the global discussion on migration? As you said at the beginning of your intervention, the migration narrative can be polarized, especially because of these migrants are taking our jobs narrative. Do you think that actually social entrepreneurship can reverse this narrative? Does it have this power?
I do think social entrepreneurship today, whether it's on the refugee crisis and the migration crisis or on climate issues and all types of social issues, I think social entrepreneurship is a very interesting model that has a lot of great potential depending on how you run it and what you have access to when you're running it. I think that the most interesting, you know, dynamic when it comes to aid and humanitarian crises is that as social enterprises, because social enterprises tend to be small, we're more nimble, we're less captive of our donor requirements, right? We're less bureaucratic. We can do much more because we tend to be smaller organizations. So I think the other important distinction is that unlike aid, what we're doing at NaTakallam is really providing income opportunities, almost employment opportunities to displaced people, as opposed to giving them aid, which is not sustainable. So I think the major distinction is sustainability and also lots more nimbleness as a social enterprise.
To conclude, how do you think that the private and public sectors could engage more in conversation in order to tackle the issue of migration? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that all sectors have things to learn from each other and to mutually benefit from each other. And when we're talking about such major challenges like migration, everyone should be coming to the table and bringing their strengths to the table so that there can be complementarity. I also think that there's a tendency to just focus on this public-private partnership dynamic, and I think we're seeing a lot of it, and I think it's great, and I think it's very important. But I would also push for much more engagement of local organizations and small organizations, because even if you're at a public-private sector organization meeting, a conference or whatnot, it tends to just be focused on the large players. And I think that's unfortunate because large players can do a lot, but small players can also do things that the larger ones can't do. The small players have a different understanding of local dynamics, which is critical. We tend to oversimplify scenarios. We try to find sweeping solutions that don't take into consideration the local context. So I think that I'm a big supporter of the public-private sector partnership model. I think it still needs work to really embrace all types of organizations, all sizes. And I think that will help move us forward.
Aline, thank you very much. Hope we'll be in touch again.
Thank you for having me, Marco, and the entire team. Take care.